On January 15, 1978, a man walked into a Florida State University sorority house in the middle of the night. In less than an hour, 4 women would be attacked. 2 of them would be dead. Another student would be brutally attacked in a nearby apartment. And the man responsible was already a fugitive. Just 1 month later, a police officer in Pensacola would pull over a stolen car and unknowingly stop one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. His name was Ted Bundy. By the time police finally understood who they were dealing with, women had already been disappearing across several states. And even after Bundy was caught, tried, and sentenced to death, one question remained. How many women had he actually killed? Because the answer is still unknown. This is the story of Ted Bundy. Born as Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 years old and unmarried when she gave birth to him. At the time, having a child outside marriage was heavily stigmatized, and Louise initially took Ted to live with her parents in Philadelphia. For years, Bundy was raised under an unusual family arrangement. His grandparents presented themselves as his parents, while Louise was introduced to him as his sister. Eventually, the truth became known. Louise moved to Washington with Ted, and in 1951, she married a man named Johnny Bundy. Ted took his stepfather's surname. Accounts of Bundy's childhood have often been used to construct a neat explanation for the crimes that followed. A troubled childhood, family secrets, emotional instability, and early fascination with disturbing subjects. But there is no simple childhood event that explains why someone becomes a serial killer. There were stories about Bundy becoming fascinated with knives and morbid subjects as a child. Still, many of the more dramatic stories surrounding his early years come from later accounts and should not be treated as a definitive psychological origin story. What we know is that Ted Bundy was intelligent. He did well academically. He was capable of presenting himself as polite, reliable, and socially competent. And as he got older, he became increasingly interested in stealing, deception, and peeping into people's homes. Bundy's crimes did not suddenly appear out of nowhere in adulthood. There was a history of boundary violations. But there was also another side to him. Ted Bundy could appear completely ordinary. He studied psychology at the University of Washington and graduated in 1972. He became involved in politics, worked on a Republican campaign, and received a letter of recommendation from Washington Governor Daniel Evans. He was also deeply interested in law and eventually attended law school in Utah, although he never completed the degree. People around him often described him as intelligent, personable, ambitious, and charming. And this is where the image of Ted Bundy really starts to take shape. Because people have spent decades asking the same question. How could somebody who looked like that possibly be a murderer? The simple answer is that murderers do not have a particular appearance. Bundy's intelligence and social skills did not make him a killer, but they helped him move through the world without immediately attracting suspicion. He could look respectable, he could sound educated, he could appear vulnerable, and in some cases, he could convince women that he needed their help. That would become one of his most effective methods. In late 1960s, Bundy became involved with a woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, who later wrote under the name Liz Kendall in her book The Phantom Prince. Their relationship lasted for years. To the outside world, Bundy could appear to be a normal young man in a normal relationship. But by the time the 1970s arrived, something else was happening. In 1974, young women began disappearing in Washington state. Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her home in Seattle in January 1974. Then Donna Manson disappeared. Then Susan Rancourt. Then Jurgen Hawkins. Then Brenda Ball. Women were disappearing from college campuses, bars, and public spaces. Investigators initially had individual cases. They did not yet have a complete picture. Witnesses began reporting a young man who sometimes approached women while wearing a sling or using crutches. He would ask for help. Sometimes he claimed he was injured. And sometimes he offered to show them something near his Volkswagen Beetle. The tactic was simple. He made himself look harmless. Then came Lake Sammamish State Park. On July 14, 1974, 2 young women disappeared from the park within hours of each other. This time, there were witnesses. Several people remembered a young man who introduced himself as Ted. He had approached women in broad daylight, asking for help with a boat. The police now had something they had desperately needed. descriptions of the suspect, a name, a vehicle, and witnesses who had actually seen him. The investigation began to expand. It was becoming clear that several disappearances might be connected, and eventually Ted Bundy's name began appearing in investigative records. But there was a major problem. The disappearances were spread across jurisdictions. Washington investigators were trying to solve murders in Washington, and other agencies were looking at missing women elsewhere. Information did not move between police departments nearly as easily as it does today. Investigators were essentially trying to assemble a puzzle while different people possessed different pieces. Bundy, meanwhile, moved. That summer, he relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, to continue his education. And the disappearances did not stop. This is one of the reasons the Bundy story became so difficult to untangle. He could cross state lines while the investigators remained fragmented. He could live an apparently normal life in one place, while another police department was investigating a woman who had disappeared hundreds of miles away. Then on November 8, 1974, something happened that finally gave investigators a living witness. 18-year-old Carol DaRonch was shopping at a mall in Utah when a man approached her and claimed to be a police officer. He told her there had been an attempted theft involving her car and that she needed to come with him. She eventually followed him to a Volkswagen. Inside the vehicle, the situation changed immediately. The man attempted to handcuff her, he threatened her, and he tried to overpower her. But Carol fought back. She escaped from the vehicle and survived. And that decision, to fight instead of giving in, would become one of the most important moments in the entire Bundy investigation. Because now, police had a victim who could describe the attacker. They did not yet have Ted Bundy in custody, but they were getting closer. And Bundy was about to make the first major mistake that would bring him into direct contact with investigators. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Robert Hayward stopped Bundy's Volkswagen after observing suspicious driving. The car immediately raised questions. The passenger seat had been removed, and when officers searched the vehicle, they found objects including handcuffs, rope, a ski mask, pantyhose with holes cut into them, and other tools. None of those objects alone proved that Bundy was a serial killer, but taken together, they were deeply suspicious. More importantly, the officer remembered information about a kidnapping in the area. Bundy was arrested. For the first time, investigators had their suspect. But there was still a problem. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him with murder yet. And Bundy knew exactly how to exploit that. He remained calm, he spoke confidently. He insisted the evidence meant nothing. It worked for a while, but investigators weren't finished. They kept digging. They interviewed people who knew Bundy, and one of those people was Elizabeth Klopfer. She had already started to suspect that something about Ted was wrong. There were strange objects, unexplained possessions, things that seemed to appear without a clear source. And then there was the way he reacted when questioned. She had once found a meat cleaver in his desk. She noticed other suspicious items. She remembered that Bundy was deeply protective of his appearance and particularly uncomfortable when she talked about cutting her long hair. At the time, none of those things were enough to tell her the truth. But looking backward, the pieces were becoming easier to recognize. Eventually, Bundy would be convicted of the kidnapping of Carol DaRonch. And that conviction would finally put him behind bars. But not for murder, not yet. The man suspected of killing multiple women had been convicted because one of them survived. And that distinction would become incredibly important, because Bundy was about to prove just how dangerous he could be when allowed to escape. And once he did, the investigation would turn into a nationwide manhunt. Bundy's conviction for kidnapping Carol DaRonch resulted in a prison sentence of up to 15 years. At last, he was behind bars. But even then, investigators were still connecting him to other crimes. Bundy was facing charges in Colorado for the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who had disappeared while staying at a ski resort in Aspen. And while awaiting proceedings in Colorado, Bundy did something that sounds impossible today. He escaped. In June 1977, Bundy was representing himself during a preliminary hearing. At one point, he was left alone in a second-floor courthouse room. There was an open window, Bundy climbed out, and just like that, he was gone. Search teams looked through the area while Bundy moved through Aspen. He was eventually captured 8 days later. You would think that would have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Bundy had already demonstrated that he was willing to exploit weaknesses in the justice system, and 6 months later he did it again. This time, the plan was much more deliberate. Bundy had lost a significant amount of weight, so he could squeeze through a small opening in the ceiling of his jail cell. At night, he practiced moving through the crawl space. He prepared for the escape. On December 30, 1977, he finally went through with it. He arranged books and bedding on his bed to make it appear as though he was sleeping. Then he climbed through the ceiling. Bundy dropped into the apartment of the chief jailer's family, stole clothing, and walked out of the building. He had escaped again. This time, he was not going to be caught quickly. Bundy disappeared, and now the FBI was involved. In February 1978, the FBI placed him on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. A reward of $100,000 was offered for information leading to his capture. Bundy's photograph was distributed nationwide. Law enforcement agencies were warned that he was dangerous. Investigators were also using the case to develop new methods of analyzing serial offenders. And Bundy became one of the cases studied by agents trying to understand patterns in serial murder. Investigators knew he favored young women. They knew he had often approached women in places where young people gathered, and they knew the Volkswagen connection. But the most important fact was simple: Ted Bundy was out and he was still killing. On January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University. It was around 3 in the morning. 4 women were attacked. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were killed. Katie Kleiner and Karen Chandler survived. Within roughly an hour, another student, Cheryl Thomas, was attacked in a nearby apartment. The entire sequence was terrifyingly fast. The attacker moved from room to room, attacking sleeping women while they were almost completely defenseless. And then he disappeared into the night. Police immediately began investigating. One resident, Nita Neary, had seen a man leaving the sorority house. Investigators also recovered forensic evidence. There were hairs, there were other physical traces, and there was a bite mark photographed on Lisa Levy's body. At the time, prosecutors would present the bite mark comparison as important evidence linking Bundy to the murders. The evidence was accepted by the courts along with eyewitness testimony and other circumstantial and forensic evidence. The idea that bite marks can reliably identify one specific person has since been heavily challenged. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has found that bite mark analysis lacks sufficient scientific support to identify an individual from a mark left on skin. So when we talk about this trial today, we shouldn't say that the bite mark proved Bundy was the killer. It was evidence used by the prosecution and accepted by the court at the time. But modern forensic science does not give that technique the confidence it was once given. That distinction matters because the Bundy story has often been distorted by hindsight. And this is one of those places where the truth is actually more interesting than the legend. Investigators had multiple pieces of evidence. An eyewitness had seen Bundy. Hairs from the crime scene were compared with samples from Bundy. He had been living near the area. He was behaving suspiciously, and he was already a wanted fugitive. The case against him was not resting on one mysterious bite mark. Bundy had escaped custody, crossed the country, and arrived in Florida while already suspected of murder. And he wasn't finished. On February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her school in Lake City, Florida. She was later found dead. Bundy was eventually convicted of her kidnapping and murder. The Leach case was different from the Chi Omega murders. There were no surviving eyewitnesses to the killing itself. Instead, prosecutors built a circumstantial case around Bundy's movements, witnesses, physical evidence, and connection to the circumstances surrounding Leach's disappearance. And then, Bundy made another mistake. On February 15, 1978, he was driving a stolen Volkswagen in Pensacola. A police officer stopped the vehicle. The officer quickly discovered that the car was stolen. When he attempted to arrest Bundy, Bundy fought back. He struck the officer and ran. The officer chased him and eventually subdued him. This was the end. After years of disappearing, crossing state lines, escaping custody, and avoiding investigators, Ted Bundy had finally run out of places to go. The search of the vehicle produced further evidence, including identification cards belonging to the women connected with Florida State University and stolen property. Bundy was finally in custody, and this time there was no escape. What followed was a series of trials that turned him into a national obsession. The courtroom became another stage. Bundy represented himself at points. He cross-examined witnesses. He argued with prosecutors. He cultivated an image of confidence and intelligence. The newspapers loved it. The media had already turned the hunt for Bundy into a spectacle. Now, the trials transformed him into something even bigger, a criminal celebrity. That distinction would become important after his death, because a man responsible for murdering women was increasingly being discussed in a language people normally reserve for actors, politicians, or celebrities. People talked about his appearance, his intelligence, his courtroom behavior, his girlfriends, his clothes, his smile. But underneath all of that was a much simpler reality. Women were dead. Families had been waiting for answers, and some bodies had never been found. Even after his conviction, Bundy still held information that investigators wanted. He knew where some of the victims had been taken, he knew where some remains might have been left, and he knew which crimes he had committed. That made the final years of his life a strange negotiation. Investigators wanted answers, Bundy wanted something in return. Sometimes that meant information, sometimes that meant attention, and sometimes it meant another delay in his execution. But while Bundy was sitting on death row, one question remained unanswered. How many victims were there? Ted Bundy eventually confessed to 30 murders. That number came from Bundy himself in the final years of his life. But even that doesn't give us the true total. Bundy was convicted of 3 murders: Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy in the Omega case, and Kimberly Leach in Florida. There were other murders strongly attributed to him through evidence and investigation. There were additional killings he confessed to. And there were still other cases that remained uncertain. That is why the real number may never be known. Bundy had an obvious reason to control what he told to investigators. Information gave him power. He could reveal details about a victim, he could withhold the location of remains, he could admit to one killing and refuse to discuss another. And that meant investigators had to make a choice every time they listened to him. Was he telling the truth? Was he manipulating them? Was he trying to delay his execution? Or was he finally providing information that could help a family recover the remains of a missing woman? Sometimes they never got an answer. Bundy himself also warned investigators that there were murders he would never discuss. Some, he claimed, were too close to home. Others involved very young victims. Whether every one of these statements was truthful is impossible to determine. There is a temptation with serial killers to assume that every confession must be true. But a confession is not evidence. A confession has to be evaluated. And Bundy was an exceptionally unreliable narrator of his own crimes. That is why the distinction between confirmed, convicted, confessed, and suspected matters so much in this case. Then, in April 2026, something happened that demonstrated exactly why those distinctions matter. For more than 50 years, Utah investigators had suspected Bundy in the murder of 17-year-old Laura Ann Aim. Laura disappeared after leaving a Halloween party on October 31, 1974. Her body was found weeks later in American Fork Canyon. Bundy later admitted responsibility for her death. But Utah authorities did not simply close the case because a condemned serial killer said he had done it. They wanted physical evidence. Decades later, they finally got it. Investigators re-examined preserved evidence using newer DNA technology. The testing produced a male DNA profile that matched Bundy. On April 1, 2026, the Utah County Sheriff's Office announced that it had definitive proof that Ted Bundy murdered Laura. A case that had remained unresolved for more than half a century was finally closed. And that gives us the most important lesson in the entire story. There is a difference between a story being repeated for decades and a crime being scientifically established. Bundy may have known exactly what happened to Laura, but it took modern forensic technology to independently prove it. And there may still be other victims whose cases never get the same conclusion. That uncertainty has followed Bundy since the 1970s. But before he died, there was still one final chapter. In 1979, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega murders. Hundreds of journalists followed the proceedings. Bundy's courtroom behavior became part of the spectacle. He appeared confident, at times almost theatrical. Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. He would receive another death sentence for Kimberly Leach. But execution did not happen immediately. For years, Bundy remained on death row. During that period, investigators continued interviewing him. He eventually confessed to numerous murders. In the final days before his execution, he provided additional admissions. But even then, the full picture never emerged. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in Florida at 42 years old. Outside the prison, large crowds celebrated. People cheered, they sang, they set off fireworks. For many, the death of Ted Bundy represented the end of a nightmare. But for the families of unidentified victims, it was also the end of the one person who might have known where their loved ones were. Bundy was dead. His remains were cremated and his ashes were reportedly scattered in Washington. And the mythology continued. Books were published, movies were made, documentaries followed, interviews were replayed. Bundy's appearance became part of the story. So did his courtroom performances. His relationships and the Volkswagen also did. Eventually, even the killer himself became closer to a pop culture character than a real person. And that is worth pushing back against. Ted Bundy wasn't interesting because he was handsome. He wasn't interesting because he was a genius. He wasn't some flawless criminal mastermind who outsmarted everyone around him. He made mistakes constantly. He left witnesses. He was identified, stopped by the police, arrested, and convicted. He escaped because of weaknesses in the systems holding him. The reason he remained dangerous for so long was much more ordinary. He operated across state lines at a time when law enforcement agencies did not share information as efficiently as they do today. He exploited people's willingness to help someone who appeared injured or vulnerable. He understood how to present himself as respectable, and he took advantage of the gaps between what investigators knew and what they could actually prove. The women he murdered weren't characters in his story. These were people with families, relationships, careers, plans, and features. That is easy to lose when a case becomes famous. The killer gets remembered, the victims become a list. And that's the wrong way around. Because the real tragedy of the Bundy case isn't that one man became infamous. It's that so many young women disappeared while investigators were still trying to understand what was happening. Some were found, some were identified years later, and some have never been recovered. Laura and Ames' case shows that these investigations do not necessarily end when a suspect dies. Technology changes, evidence can survive, and decades later, something that investigators couldn't prove in 1974 can sometimes be proven in 2026. There may be other cases like that. There may also be cases that never receive an answer. Bundy took some of those answers with him, and after everything we now know, the most honest number of victims is still not 30. We don't know the real number, we know what he was convicted of, and we know that modern forensic evidence continues to add pieces to the puzzle decades after his execution. But there is still no final number, and there may never be one, because Ted Bundy is dead, but the investigation isn't. I would love to hear your thoughts below. I appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.